outside past there, and there's one down at the end there. So I just found out about this one. Viplov said we have till 6:15. Now, I didn't hear any firm stops, and then suddenly yesterday they said 6. Oh, no, you got to finish. We've got a hard stop. So I don't know what's up. And cell phones, just silence the ringer. If you have to go out, if you have to leave to go to the restroom, to just, vote. And if you're not working for you, 2 things. If you're not happy with the session, 2 things. First of all, let me know what's not working, and we'll try and fix it. And if it's not working anyways, vote with your feet. There's another session going on. There's a day outside, whatever. I want, get what you want to get out of this. You got to be responsible. I'm going to suggest actually invest the thought in the exercise I suggest. And I'm actually going to ask you to work with somebody else, or maybe even a little group as a team. And you'll get more out of it. You'll really get the benefits if you invest the effort. And again, I talk fast. I get passionate. If I zoom past something too quickly, you got to stop me. I don't know what you've missed. Only you do. And I'm happy to stop and happy to go back over it. And same thing with anything that you disagree with or question or whatever. I'm perfectly happy to have discussions. So you saw this alignment. I hope you were here earlier. What makes good education practice, what makes an engaging experience are perfectly aligned. What we want to do and what we're going to spend some time doing is systematically going into the steps that let you get those lined up. Okay? You guys with me on that? Is that what you're hoping for? If you're not, that's the wrong place. So I want to elaborate those elements I pointed out, and I'm going to use the quest game. And I've already mentioned this a little bit. For kids who grow up without parents, they have to survive on the streets at age 18. This game was specifically designed for those kids before they're out on the streets. It was designed for them to explore, safely fail in a place where it doesn't. That's one of the things games do. But it was designed to drive discussion with the counselors. So it didn't include everything that they might discover. It was designed to have them discover it, and then if they have questions about it, they should talk to their counselors. Because by and large, they don't talk to the counselors as much as they could and should, particularly about life after care. So the first thing was clear goals. And hidden in this game, it's not right up front. It's not when you start the game you see the goal, but look down, there's a couple buttons, and one is for hints. And it would use your current state to recommend something you do. It had a very simple coaching engine in it. But there's also just information. And in the information, you'll find the aim of the goal is to enter the mansion. And entering the mansion is a metaphor for having a stable living arrangement. In other words, you've got, and I think in the normal game, there was 3 levels of house. There was of living. There was a shack, there was an apartment, and there was a house. And you at least had to get to the apartment level. And then we actually had difficulty levels you could change, but let's just talk about the basic. You had to have a certain amount of money in the bank, and you had to have a job. I think those were the 3, and your health had to be good enough. And those were the conditions under which you could then say, go to the mansion, and if you tried to go there, and if you didn't have everything you needed, it would bounce you back, but eventually you could succeed and go there, and you won the game. Challenge. It isn't easy. Life on the streets isn't easy. So we had a level of challenge. When you go in and ask for a job at a shop, by and large, the odds were you weren't going to get one. Even if you go to what they had back then was the Community Employment Service, CES, and you would go in there and they'd have all the jobs. But even there wouldn't necessarily be a job you were qualified for. If you tried to get in, there were 3 levels of jobs. There was a sort of a laborer, a manager, and an executive type of thing. And you couldn't get an executive without some schooling. You could go to school. The story, in this case, was relatively straightforward. You were in a city and you had to survive. In the HyperCard version, and I don't think it's in the web version, but literally you'd see the doors of care open and you're out on the street, and that's how the game starts. Figure out what to do, guys. And you can wander around. This, in fact, is where you first start. And the care office is correct there, and there was other things around. This is 1/4 of the town, and then there was a second town, which was also 4 quadrants. And you can see there's a number of places you can go along here. So there was a story, a setting in which this occurred, and your actions affected the game. If you chose to go out and get a condom, then it was available for you if the random event of having the opportunity to have sex came up. Now, if you didn't choose to go out and get that condom and the opportunity came up, you could choose to have the sex, but it would be unprotected. Even if you had the condom, you could choose not to use it, and then you would still run the risks. But your choices, the actions you took, affected what was available in the game. And you cared about the game. These kids at this age are interested in drugs and sex. Good old human hormones, puberty, and all those good things. So these were things they were aware of. And they could address it in the game while it was safe. So they were interested in the problems. And it was active. There were a number of things they could do. Just in the care office, they could ask for a cup of coffee, which actually keep them from being quite as hungry. They could ask for help, a hint. They could ask for money. They could ask for a letter of reference. If you remember before, I said that when you go to the bank to try and open an account, because you can get money from the government, but you can't unless you have a bank account, one of the pieces of ID you can get is a letter of reference from CARE. But you have to go around and explore and discover it. You could even ask for a job. But your choices and the places you choose to go determine what happens, because there's an engine on it. Now, one of the principles is you act on the world in ways that are consonant with the world, and there were arrows there. So you would, just one indication is the arrows you would navigate, and you directly click on things you wanted, like coffee. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, it's okay. Is this the right time to interrupt you?
Please, anytime.
So what I want
As long as it's related.
I'm teasing. And before you moved on to the details of the game.
Sure.
What I wanted to understand was that how were the target segment made to use this game, and at what age? So 18, as you said, was the age they would leave the home.
Right.
So
this was typically it was about 11 to 13.
So how was it pushed onto them, or?
These kids are in care centers, foster care, or they're in orphanages or foster care, but there are care centers where they go to talk to counselors. In those care centers, among other things, were banks of computers. And the kids would go there and play games. So they wanted this game there also. And the kids could go in and play this game as well as the other games. And so that was the notion, that it was their choice to play this particular game. And if they did, they could play it. And then if they had challenges, they could talk to the counselor. But they weren't forced to do it. Now, interestingly, after we released it, somebody found out about it, a high school that wasn't these kids. And they actually used it just with their own relatively healthy kids. And in fact, other kids who came over to our house to play we'd have a party, and the parent would bring their kid, and they didn't know what to do with them, so we'd sit them down and have them play this game, and they did. They enjoyed it. But it was totally voluntary. And yet, because the kids were going in and playing games, but this was one more central to them, and they actually found out, well, like I said, they liked it enough that they released it. They did a big release at the Hard Rock Cafe, and as a thank you, they gave me this really nice sweater. I'd prefer money, but it was a nice sweater.
I have another question on that.
Sure.
So, what was the use, and what were the efforts made to make it popular for
What were the
children?
efforts made to make it engaging?
Engaging, definitely. I mean, it seems engaging, but to start off, and what was the effort made to, so if if the child has 10 options, 10 gaming options in that care center, how would he?
Sorry, go ahead.
So how did you ensure, or did you take any measures in that direction that he chooses this game over the other games?
I didn't.
Okay.
Now here's the deal. These kids are highly protected. We couldn't even go into the care centers. We couldn't even talk to kids who were in care to develop it. As I mentioned, we talked to kids outside of care. Now, the working group for the children's, called the Aftercare Project, which was a group of a subset of people. So Australia-wide has the Children's Welfare Agencies. The ACWA is the Association of Children's Welfare Agencies for Australia. And they had a working group called the Aftercare Project that had spent the money on the video and the comic book and the poster, and then they realized the game was what they wanted. So they got everything else done. When I finished this and we went and got it polished, and then they had it ported to the PC and buggered it up, they had a big release. And they invited children's welfare agencies and media and stuff, and they released they gave everybody a big bag full of the poster and the video and the comic book and our game. And I wasn't allowed to. So, direct manipulation, they operate on the world directly. We tried to make as direct a mapping as possible, partly because these kids have horribly low literacy. They don't know how to read. They hop around from school to school. They don't really engage in school because I've seen this with my kids and some of their friends who are no longer their friends because these kids weren't succeeding in school, and then the only way to have save face is to say, oh, well, school's not cool, and therefore only uncool kids do well in school. These kids are saving face by not doing well in school, and so we had to minimize the amount of text to do as much with graphics as we could. Feedback, you know how you're doing. You can see how much, there's two representations of money. This is the money in your pocket. Then there's the money in your backpack. You can have bags. And then there's the money in the bank. But you're, in this case, this time, very hungry. And health is a consequence because they're plenty rested, but they're very hungry, so the health's kind of in between. Health was mostly a function of sleep and hunger. But if you got sick, you could occasionally just randomly get a cold and you have to go see the doctor, otherwise it would persist. Or if you caught a sexually transmitted disease, your health would go down unless you went to the doctor and get it fixed. Although one of the chances, it was essentially, again, a probability thing. It was like a slot machine and visually represented that way. You could get HIV, and then effectively you would just not get better. But we didn't kill the kids in the game. This was not good. So they would just get too sick to continue. And this could be if they weren't managing their health. If they'd somehow run out of money and they couldn't get food, they would just get too sick to continue as well. So that was the, failing in the game was getting too sick to continue. There were random events maintaining motivation. Some were positive. A relative could give you a bag of money, woohoo, or take you out for a meal. Or you could get mugged. If you didn't have some money in the bank, you carrying it all around with you, you could lose it all. This is what happens in the real world. It's trying to impart some lessons about what's important. Now, thinking of implementation, I have said these principles apply to even writing better multiple choice questions. And indeed, so here is a whole learning experience, but each practice is an individual little multiple choice question with a setup, an action, and a feedback. You set up, you make a decision, you get feedback on that consequence, and you get a totally different one. These are okay, if you, doesn't require a lot of technology to do that, so it makes it very viable, but even those are better than knowledge test multiple choice questions. Here you're making them apply, make them make a choice, a discrimination. You make tougher questions that really discriminate whether they need it. And if it's a big gap, you might first have simpler ones and then more complex ones, but you can do this with just little multiple choice questions. I'm making some editorial statements here. Your intro, consider a cartoon like I showed yesterday. Your concept, some model and map. Your examples are really best in story form because we process those. Our architecture is hardwired to process those really well. But then your multiple choice questions written in little scenarios are what the initial opportunity you have. And like I said, if you do nothing else, try that out. The next step are linear scenarios where each of those choices is still essentially a multiple choice question, but they're all set in the same world and they proceed. And the way you make this work is they make their choice, and if it's not a good choice, you just basically have in the feedback, not only the feedback about why it's wrong, but you have some character in the story, tell them why it's wrong, and make it right. Oh, you chose to do this. Your boss comes to, oh, I saw you were about to do this. You choose to shut down the entire network. And you choose that option, and then the message comes back, your boss managed to catch you before you shut down the entire network. He said, look, we don't have any evidence yet that the entire network is compromised. Let's just do this, whatever it is. And everything goes back to the same next point. No matter what you do, something makes it right. So at the end of the choice, you're set up for the next question. So that's what I call a linear scenario. And in fact, the game I'm going to show you, we originally did content for them in a linear scenario, and they liked it so much, they then asked us to make a game for it. With the only small problem that we'd already made the scenario. So it was actually one of the challenging tasks I've had in my life was trying to figure out how to make an entertaining game on something they already had learned about. But I could do it. But in reality, you get different consequences and different choices depending on the choice you make. So the next level is actually to make branching scenarios so your different choices take you to different places. This is still low development cost. If you're going to do mass quantities of these, there are industrial strength tools. Next learn SimWriter is specifically designed to do this, and even Captivate, Adobe's Captivate, has some built-in capability to manage doing branching scenarios. Some of the more powerful tools actually let you carry state forward and maybe make a branch later on depending on something that happened earlier, in addition to these hardwired structures you put in. But these can really give you that whole immersive experience with one caveat. There's very little replay in these. After you've done a couple times, you've pretty much understood what's there. So the only thing that's, and if that's enough practice, this is great. Or you can produce lots of these to really give a bunch of experiences and develop the skills that have different challenges and different consequences and different misconceptions. So these can be a way to approach it with minimal technical development, but a lot of design processes. Now, all of these require, even the next one, require the same design. You need to understand the world. You need to figure out what role to put them in, what decisions they need to be, what are the misconceptions and ways they go wrong and trap and all that. You got to do that no matter what technological development level you go into. But if you go into the next level, you actually have to explicitly model the world. And that is a bit of extra work, and then the development is a little bit extra difficult. I mean, you actually have to program, build the model, and have things contingent upon the outcomes of the model. But what you get as a payoff is, as Jatinder said earlier, that you can put in that randomness. So it's not predictable every time. And that is both beneficial for learning, because you can have things happen with a frequency more frequently than it happens in real life if it's really important. For instance, the one we did with a partner here in India, it was about taking analgesic medicine, painkillers. Turns out the prototypical one is morphine, and morphine has a side effect of respiratory complications. If you have asthma, you have a high likelihood of having respiratory complications if you're given it. Now, asthma only happens 10% roughly in the real world, but if you get respiratory complications, it's really a big issue. So in our game, you actually have a 50% chance of getting a patient with asthma, just because we want to give you practice in dealing with the side effects. So that probability and stuff can be managed, and it gives you replay. If you manage it right, they'll never see the exact same sequence of situations, and you can then play it again and again and again until your level of confidence, or until you've demonstrated a sufficient level of competence. The notion is that outside the world you might have an introduction, but then you're situated in the world, and each action you take drives you to new situations calculated by a simulation underneath it that's driving it. There may be concepts and examples embedded in the world. Imagine you're doing workplace simulation, and say you're doing advertising design. You might have a library in the game office where you can pull off previous campaigns that are annotated. Those are examples. You might have the quick book reference of ad principles, and that would be a concept just embedded in the world that you can pull off a virtual shelf in the game. Then you might drive people outside to external resources as well if they really want to get on top of it. And then eventually, and there'll be guided reflection, and eventually they'll segue out of the learning experience. And you do need external reflection. As I said before, I do not believe a simulation game is a complete learning experience. So that's sort of the space of implementations. So if you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it. So what do we need to start designing a scenario? This is a quiz. And draw upon what we were talking about earlier today. What do you need? You're going to need a context. And where do you get those from? From the subject matter experts. Well, yes, they will tell you, but where they're really going to get is where those decisions play out in the real world. And then you're going to either dress it up in a fantasy or make it very real and just exaggerate the consequence. But we need a context. What else do we need? Goals, objectives. What are our learning objectives? If we're not starting with our learning objectives and starting from that point decisions, we're wasting a lot of time. And there's too much garbage. Using a stronger word. There's too much garbage edutainment out there that has really murky learning goals. How many of you heard of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? All right. Okay, those of you who have, what is its learning goal? What is the learning goal in Carmen Sandiego? Geography, right. It's about the world. Turns out that's not what happens. Because what the kids do, and for those of you who don't know, what it happens is they give you clues. Like, you're chasing these criminals around the world. And they'll give you a clue. Well, they were flying to one of these 3 airports, Paris, Rome, or Hong Kong, and they mentioned lira as the coin. Which airport? Huh? Italy, but of the 3 I mentioned, it would be Rome. Now, they play the game with an almanac. And the notion was by answering these questions, they'd learn that lira is in Rome, is in Italy, right? But they'd look it up in the almanac. The only thing they ended up learning was how to use an almanac. They didn't remember any of the other stuff because they were focused on the goal of just getting the answer to pursue the criminal, and they learned how to look it up. And so you have to be wary and get the right objectives. So we've got to get our analysis right first. And this is the key structure, and I want you to keep this in mind as you start working forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through a case study. In the amount of time we have, we're going to do it really quickly. Normally I take a whole day with this, all right? But they've given me about an hour and a half. So I want to just set the context for I want to tell you why I use this case study. When I used to do this, I'd do this particular case study, and afterwards people go, I don't know why I did that case study. I didn't like that case study. So let me make very clear why I chose this one. First of all, I'm familiar with it. And it's relatively generic. So everybody has enough information to actually be able to do it. It doesn't require too much specific domain knowledge, and I can give you the very brief amount you need. So that's why I choose this one. And once I started mentioning that, my complaints about why I chose this particular case study went away. So your activity is going to be getting information from the subject matter expert. Now this is your time to tap into your inner Bollywood star. Let me explain why. You're going to pair up. And one of you is going to play the good little instructional designer, hopefully play the smart instructional designer, and the other one's going to play the subject matter expert. And that's where you get to tap in your skills. I don't want you to be a very compliant subject matter expert. I want you to be a real subject matter expert. So whichever the pair of you is a subject matter expert, be a real one. Kind of, surly, I don't have a lot of time, gruff, whatever it is, your experience. We're not going to swap in the interest of time. So pair up right now and figure out who's going to be the subject matter expert and who's going to be the designer. And you two, I think you're going to have to work together. You two, come on, pair up, get active, talk for a minute, figure out who's going to be the SME. Okay, you got us figured out. So, subject matter experts, you are experts on project management. Now, let me be clear. Project management for non-project managers. So you don't have to know. You manage projects. You manage vacations. You manage shopping expeditions. You manage additions to your house. You manage something all the time. So there's some principles you know. If you don't, let me just say that what we will focus on is the holy trinity of project management, scope, schedule, and resources. And the simple thing is, if the scope establishes what you're supposed to do, the resources you have to do it, the schedule, when you're going to do it by. Now, the real trick about that for making it active, I like it applied, is what do you do when you have a problem with one of them? What do you do if the schedule slips? If it matters, how do you cope? Anybody? Exactly. So it's a triangle. And what Jatinder said was, if the schedule slips, you either have to apply more resources, and Brooks' mythical man month, applying a late person to a project only makes it later, but forget that for now, or you reduce the scope. And it's that sort of trade-offs that's the subject matter expert's knowledge. Now, the instructional designer has to try and get out a set of objectives for the game. Okay? Clear on that? Go. One is the subject matter expert, one's the designer. Designer's trying to get objectives. The subject matter expert is trying to be a subject matter expert. With somebody. Yeah, you can work with somebody. Join somebody. Oh, yeah. This guy right there. hit that shift point. I could be totally wrong, but we need to move on. So, first of all, I want to talk to the subject matter experts. So, how did that feel being on that end of it? Did you tap it? Did you get into it? Did you really role play? Have some fun with it? Yes! Excellent. I'm proud to hear that. There's hope for you all. Absolutely. Okay, instructional designers. How did that work for you? What? Was it challenging? Now, when they, presumably if they were really role-playing, they were doing a little bit of knowledge. Good. Maybe you're a little too tough. Did any of you try and use that technique of getting them to talk about decisions as a way to try and get the shift to meaningful objectives? Okay, excellent. I mean, that to me is a trick that has worked. So but I just want you to experience it and get that shift of, and ordinarily we just swift around, but we've got this Reader's Digest condensed version of a workshop right here. But so, do you think you could do it now? Even those you were playing Smeanies, do you think you could have some handle on maybe getting to work with them if you had more than 5 minutes? And you really do need to get that focus on the objectives, the decisions. What can they do afterwards that they need to, when they go out after the learning experience that we're building for them, Mr. Smee? What do they need to be able to do that they can't do now? What decisions they need to make? And it's, ideally in this case it'd be like, just what you said. If the schedule slips, decide whether to apply more resources, decide whether to reduce the scope. The context in which that happens is going to determine that. Turns out for the California Department of Transportation, if there's a problem with scope, if slipping the schedule, so this is, the people who build your freeways, if slipping the schedule solves the problem, you're done. You don't even need to approve. Which is why your freeway projects take so long. If otherwise reduce scope, because you're never going to get more resources. That was the lesson I learned working on it, what I was doing.
In India, actually, you can spend more money for that satisfied with the week.
Oh, okay.
And still the fee
and yet you don't seem to have the budget problems we have. That's amazing. I like it. Okay, so reflection. We've been doing the reflection on the exercise. So, in this case, what we decided was, and this is actually from the game. I'm hiding as much of it as possible, so I'm not going to really constrain the creativity you're going to apply to doing this design. Getting a project to succeed, that's your job. Okay, that just get good data, pop it in and submit it, phase by phase, project by project, before the deadline. And we didn't emphasize everything because we wanted them to have to discover some of this. It's not give them everything, but getting good data. It turns out, for this task, that they used to have a waterfall method where the engineering group would do phase A and then phase B and then phase C, and stuff would pull through the gap and bad data wouldn't get caught and it would be passed on. So they were moving to a matrix structure where they had project managers who were responsible for the projects. It was amazing. Project managers had like 16 of these major projects at any one time that they were shoving through at various phases. And they had to make sure they got good data. If they didn't get good data, it really screwed things up down the line. So they were responsible. And they would have to work with the engineers to get it. Now, so the real reason for this was for the engineers to understand what project management was and why they didn't want to do it and would be glad that there were project managers doing it. That's why it was project management for non-project managers. If any engineer really got into this, they might be a good candidate for project management and then they'd go off and get the PMI certification. Sure, interruptions and small disasters was happening. We had those things happen. Come in, a stakeholder would request a bigger scope, and you have to figure out whether you can accommodate that. You just have to deal with them. Talk to your team members and stakeholders and sort things out. And that's the other part. The subtext that couldn't mention explicitly. To the engineers, when you work with project managers, don't be a jerk. Be glad. Work with them well. That was the subtext. And in fact, what we had were different personality types. I picked 4 off the web: passive aggressive and negotiator and dominator, and then regular, straightforward people. And we gave them different ways to interact with them, and you had to figure out which one was work. Your first five, you got to work with decent people, so you got the mechanics of the game down. Then you started getting random. You had some notes about who this person was, but it wasn't direct. It didn't say this is a passive aggressive. It said, like, this person will never do what they promise. And you would figure out how to talk to them. And then when you got it right, you could start getting the data you needed before the deadline, so you weren't spinning too many cycles and missing the deadline. And you get good data, and then your ratings would start going up. And you would, once you got good at it, you'd have some extra cycles. If you just reach out and touch people and get higher team member ratings and higher stakeholder ratings, that's how you'd end up winning the game. Okay? So that's just the objectives. So how do you go from objectives to a scenario?
Think of a compelling story that connects or puts the objectives in the context of exciting in the context of the game.
Right, you've got to find a story that does what? It naturally embeds the decisions and
Builds a situation.
Creates
What can go wrong?
enough excitement in the user to keep them occupied.
What can go wrong?
well, yeah, you do want to have the ways it can go wrong, and absolutely, you want it to engage the user, right? You want a storyline that works for them. So how do we design this? You don't design really a story. You design a background story or setting, but you need to design foreground action. You need to have actions that play out in the world and have consequences. You need to worry about the experience, not the polish. Back to this diagram, we got the experience right here, and then we added the polish. But if we didn't have, I see way too much e-learning that is well produced, but is under designed, and it's garbage. And unfortunately, for those of you who design regular learning, the nuances between well designed and well produced and poorly designed and well produced are subtle. And most of your buyers don't know it. And so that's why there's a lot of garbage out there. And I've been on a campaign and been blogging about it and trying to get it fixed. And again, the message I said earlier, go wild. Others will rein you in, resist it, but your learners will thank you. So exaggerate. Exaggerate. To match the interests of your audience. Partly, as someone said, I want to get something that interests them, and then we exaggerate it to get it to a level of engagement that matches the engagement they'll feel in the real world. So activity, choosing the scenario. Also work as a team. So more than just two, naturally break yourselves up into teams. I see a natural team, 3 or 4 right here. I'd like to get 3 or 4 of you at least in teams. So self-organize into teams, figure it out. Do you want me to organize you, or are you going to do it on your own? Okay. Yeah. You're going to be competing, right, against the other teams for the best solution. So don't take this. Okay, you guys not looking like you're organizing a team. Get going, all right? There's 4 back there. All right. And generate a scenario for project management for non-project managers. Hello? Okay. Setting, I want a setting and a storyline. Don't start yet. Let me get the instructions out, then I'll let you go. Get the setting and the story. In other words, what's the background story? You know, ideally you get the initial goal state, what characters perhaps, what decisions they're going to actually have to face, what's the flow. Meaningful storyline, challenging alternatives. Outcome right now, I mostly want a story setting that the player would like to be in making the decisions about project management for non-project managers. Any questions on that before I have you begin? I want to make sure I get all the questions out so everybody hears the answers before we really begin. What you can do exactly. Decide together. Well, I'll give you my answer and then you guys can work on your own subtext of that. I want you to come out with a setting, a world, characters. You know, settings can be for real, they can be science fiction, they can be Western, they can be ancient Indian legend, they could be, you know, animals, buildings, whatever it is. Find a story setting that you think the players, your audience, and if you need your audience, they're those engineers for large projects to be doing. So figure out who those are and what would interest them. Okay? Any other questions on that? Is that pretty clear? Just a good setting with a good... role that they play. So a story setting and a role for the protagonist, for the player. Okay? Go. Looks like, but you guys have part of the set. Tour, John, go around the world. Come back together for a bit now, because pretty much everybody converged on a setting, and we're already beginning to elaborate. So I want, before we go further, I want to just bring us together and reflect on that process. So, was it challenging? Yeah. Fun, hard fun, eh? Yes. Good. Do you feel like you got a setting you could carry forward? Did you go wild? Okay. Who thinks they went really wild? All right. Well, quickly, one sentence description.
So it's India versus China on a space race to put a man on moon.
Oh, cool. I like that. That's enough.
We don't that.
Simple thing. Yeah, it's about how a child manages his pocket money through the week, and he might get it.
That's enough. A really quick phrase.
Indian wedding, North Indian boy marrying a South Indian girl.
Somehow I don't do that as a project, but yeah, probably. All right, hold it, that's good. Stop that. Yeah. International Space Station prize. Okay, interesting. Anybody else want to know? That's okay. So, I like it. Interesting, a lot of space. Was this because they were engineers, you're thinking, so they'd be interested in that? Or? Well, not in this case. Yeah, you guys, I was just, it seemed like 2 or 3 of them were space out of it, but that's a relatively high proportion. I've heard circuses, designing roller coasters and things, so. Yeah. When I get to run this full day, I've had teams at the end of the day want to go out and build their solution because they're ready to sell it. They think it's viable. I love it. So, Do you think this is something you could do if you were given the opportunity? Do you think you could come together and come up with something? And that you realize that in real life, you get some ideas. Ideally, you diverge. Come up with a number of ideas, test them out in the market a little bit, get some feedback, come back, refine them, test them out. But obviously, we can't do that here. But you realize, I think all of you have lived in the real world, done big projects, and realize you can't just do what comes up in your head. You've got to go out there and do some reality testing, right? This was what we did. So we too came up with space with the rationale that when you are doing large projects like building dams and freeways, terraforming planets is only the next order of exaggeration, right? It's pretty close to what they're doing. So that's what we did. Now, it turns out it was multiple constraints. It turns out the client I did this for happened to have a unique talent for drawing alien creatures. They had done a whole book on the Star Wars fauna of a particular planet. Some publisher wanted it, and they did it. But I like to throw a little humor in. Now, so I have to give you the cultural reference, though. The U.S. Navy was doing its usual recruiting, competing with the Army and the Air Force and the Marines. And so they came up with this campaign that said, the Navy, they'd show you something really cool, like landing on a carrier, being on a submarine, and they'd say, it's not just a job, it's an adventure. So I played with that. Why take just a job when you can build new worlds? Imagine landing on a planet you created. Join the terraforming team today. And he applies, our hero Durka applies and gets approved. And of course he gets there and goes down 17 elevator floors and across 14 cubicle floors and down 300 rows to get to his cubicle and meet the boss. And along the way meets a character who sort of says, oh yeah. And just playing with the expectation and the reality that we see. Jobs usually aren't quite that exciting. And eventually the boss says, don't worry, you will get that excitement, but first you got to do all the steps to get there. Now, as I hinted at, and let me elaborate, when you're doing this, you end up gathering the data. And before you actually go to the specification stage, you really should document the audience, not just their knowledge, but now their interests as well. You need to document the decisions that you're going to embed in the consequences, and also the misconceptions that go with those decisions and the consequences. And you want to get, and the setting, and you want to get sign-off on that, right? Well, no, the settings that naturally, where these decisions occur. All that stuff you need to document. And you want to get that, so you want to say, this is what I heard, and you want to send it up and say, do you agree this is what you heard, this is what we're going to focus on for our learning goals? And you want them to come back and eventually say yes. And you try and say, here it is, circulate to everybody who cares, get it back once, and when you've got it all, we'll make our revisions and then we're done. You want to write that in a contract. Anything else up to you. Now note the asterisk. I will suggest that by and large, on big projects you will do that, period. But on small projects, and I want to argue that there's a lot of games that are in the US, it would be about the 75,000 to 200,000 size, that will make a big impact on learning. You don't need the $2.5 million games. The game companies will tell you you do, because they've got big teams that they want to keep employed. But in reality, there are a lot of learning goals you can do on small budgets. And when you do this, I will bet you, dollars to donuts, that when you get here, by the time you've documented all that, you've got an idea for your story. It's sort of emerged already among you or your team. And if possible, I like to go ahead and send that as well. And we're thinking of this setting with this character and these variables that are going to be the ones we track. And you put that in as well, just because you want to minimize the number of cycles of submissions and recycles, because that just kills you once again. So that's my recommendation, at least if it's a small project. If it's a big project, you're going to do a lot more. But if you get a big project and have a lot of really big budget to spend, I can help. So, now I want you to go back and do what you were doing, but I want you to take the next step. I know you already started elaborating, but I want you to sweat the details. I want you to flesh it out. I want you to maximize the impact to the learner. I want you to hone those decisions, bing, 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 so they're having to face in this setting, wow, what is the issue on project management I have to face? What's the decision? What are the feedback? How is it, what are the consequences going to be of the wrong decision, the right decision? In addition to what you've already done, the outcome, I want to know the characters, not just the character you're having, but the other characters. I want you to consider explicitly the exaggeration you're going to have, not only in the story, but in the events that occur that cause problems that increase the decisions. Any events that happen. Use of media, what media you're going to use to communicate this. And you're smiling, you've already been doing some of this, right? But that's okay. I want you to take a little bit more time and just practice specifically focusing on those, fleshing out the story, characters, and exaggeration. Any questions on that? No? Okay, off you go. Anybody who's working alone, just join a team. Help out. I love it. Wandering around. How did that feel? You guys, ready to take it to market? What went well? What? Applying for pay. Yeah. Did you have diverse voices, different ideas in your groups? Did that help? If you manage the process right, it's much more powerfully open to those ideas and use them to build, sort of the yes and type of approach. Appreciative inquiry can be really great. So, was anything difficult or challenging? What was challenging? Huh? It was fun. Good. Oh, I like to hear that. Absolutely. To me, that's the creative part. That's the most interesting bit, is being creative and coming up with something that both within constraints. So you have to achieve the learning goal, but there's so much variety, and yet you want to put constraints on something you can deliver and you think will engage the learners. But the exaggeration to me is really the fun part. Did you find some really good events to cause hiccups to your learner? Yeah, you were evil. I like that. Any other comments, questions, or issues on that? That's it. You need to then sweat out the details, and you got to get concrete. Yes?
They are not there, it depends on context, or depends on the cost and everything else.
Well, yeah. Characters that you need, right. The ones that make this story believable and no extra ones. So anyone, if in your project management, in your setting, when the problem happens, how would that be communicated? Would it be, in our one, I'll show you in a second, we had a mechanism that allowed us to simplify some things. You want to find tools in your design that strip away necessary details and strip away unnecessary details and have you focusing on only the necessary ones, so that the learner doesn't have to do anything that isn't particularly focused on the story and yet carries the story in a believable way. So you want that. Oh, we killed the projector, didn't we? Well, we don't need that image right now anyways, but thank you for restarting. And you can pause it a few more than you might need and then strip them away. But at the end of the day, they have to advance the story. It's same like characters in a movie or a book. They have to in some way carry forward the story or they're not relevant. They might be there as people you go and ask for help. One of the games I would love to do, I really worry about the effects of advertising on the public. So I want to create a game, and I came up with this before Mad Men came out, but it's Mad Av. And you're a beginning advertising person, and you're trying to get up to, to the Don Draper level, exactly. But to do so, you have to use ads, and you have to essentially be evil, really trying to leverage every ounce of what makes ads work. And the reason I want them to play that role is to understand what ad agencies do. And in it, I always thought there would be a couple of characters. One would be this old wise guy who you go and ask, but he tells you these elliptical stories. They're really examples, but the way he tells it is one of those, those sort of irritating people who sort of tell elliptical stories and they're relevant, but they're really hard to pull the meaning. I wanted to have that in there just because it'd be fun. Make somebody work to understand it. So you could have characters that sort of are resources. I do think you might have some concepts embedded in the stories I mentioned and examples, but they might be on the shelf, but it might be in the tales this person tells as well. So they might be repositories of learning resources, but they also could be advanced story. Somebody brings you, a stakeholder comes in and goes, oh, the scope you're talking about isn't near enough. In our story, we had 4 levels of project scope. So there was sort of minimal, moderate, big, and ridiculous. So, it might be a 2-lane freeway, a 4-lane freeway, an 8-lane freeway, and a freeway with loops in them, just for fun. Now, none of the projects ever started in ridiculous, but a stakeholder could come in and ask for it to be. So, because in ours we had to have stories. So it's a judgment call. That's part of the creativity, but the test is that quote I had from Antoine Saint-Duperret. I don't know how to pronounce that properly, but I love that quote, that it's not how much you got in, it's what you can't, what you can't take away. Okay, we're good. So any other questions, issues on that?
So when you're trying to say that less is more, it's very difficult because how do you handle that essentially?
The way I handle it is the way John Allison recommends in his book on dealing with SME. It's based on his PhD thesis. I wrote a review on my blog if you want to find the title because I don't remember it, but he says you've got to acknowledge their expertise in the domain, and you've got them to acknowledge. You have to get them to acknowledge your expertise in the learning design. And if they think if they think they're game experts, use your learning basis to argue against it. Oh, we were going to violate Swallow's cognitive load. If they're going to argue they're learning experts, then use the game stuff. Oh, well, we can't overproduce it. We'll blow too much money. And money's a good argument for any overproduction argument. But you've got to be clever. Ideally, you get a great relationship based on credibility that says, look, I've designed these games. They're good games. They're successful. You really establish yourself as an expert in the field. Let's marry those in the appropriate way. That's the ideal in the win-win dialogue, but sometimes you may have to play other cards because not everybody's a reasonable human being, unfortunately. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the problems in the world we do. So, any other questions on that? So this is what we created. I created a PDA, essentially, that was your digital support. It handled all the things I didn't want the learner to worry about. So it kept a list of the projects and phases and knew which one you should focus on, which one had the next deadline. So when you asked for the next project, it popped it up. And then, it had instructions that told you about your goals and how to use it. And so you'd have a list of projects, and the top one's the next one that had a deadline due. And when you drill into it, you'd get a list of features. It would have its budget and scope, or no, budget and schedule. And you can't quite read that. It's not, I don't know if it's not focused well or too small. But then also, not only the budget, but the budget variance and the acceptable budget variance. And as long as you really didn't have to care about what the budget was, that was established. but you had to make sure that your variance, budget and schedule, was not more than the acceptable one. If it was, you'd have to go to the person who did it. In this case, we actually, you can't tell there, I'm not tall enough to point, but do you see the table there with the 4 red things on the left? The top one of those going across, the first one has no data. It's missing data. By the way, whatever, the problems came up about 1 or every 4 projects or so. One of them would be the budget variance, the other one would just be missing data. In either case, you have to go talk to the appropriate person and ask them for the data. Now, if they're a reasonable person, you just ask nicely. If they're a dominator, you ask more firmly. If they're passive-aggressive, you just tell them what the heck to do. That's may not be right, but that's what I pulled off the web somewhere and decided to use as a framework, because it didn't matter what it was. It was mostly about dealing with difficult. You just had to have some difficulty in some way to do it. And if you do it well, you got your boss saying, good job. And again, I mentioned the thing. So that was the setting. We, the characters, the pictures are somewhat vibrant, but there's not a lot of information in them. Just minimal information in them responding to you and your choices of option and the feedback on how you're doing. It may not be the best answer. It's what we came up with. It was that multiple constraints of the audience. It was one level of exaggeration for them and interested the engineers, and it matched the talents of the team. Not a bad set of constraints to try and match. How do we map from scenario to system? What do we need to go from a storyline and actions to have a system that can actually generate the interactions we need? Oh, thought you were saying, no.
Map the story onto a concept flow so that you know what are the
Well, I need a basis on which things change and... Well, you need a game design document. What the game design document... If it's not a branching scenario, if it's not a linear scenario, but if it's actually a simulation driven, what do we need? We need a model specifying the world. In danger, this is difficult stuff. I'm not going to, in the full workshop, sometimes when I do it in 2 days, actually have some people try to do some modeling. We don't have time. That's a long and hard exercise. There's a reason I go into it a bit, though, because I want you to understand what it is. And if you're the type of person who can do it, to have a beginning framework, and if you're not, to really appreciate the people who can, okay? What you have, another way to look at the whole game is there's initialization. The initialization can have some randomness. So each of the projects I randomly pulled from a pool of project names. They wouldn't let me use Giva Dam. They made me take that out. But have some fun with these names, right? Bad puns are me. By the way, I have a lesson for you. You really want to do good game design? I have a hard message for you. You're going to have to do some work. You're going to have to play more games. You're going to have to read more books. You're going to have to see more movies. You're going to have to go more theme parks. I'm serious. You really got to understand what makes things fun. And you got to continually try bad jokes, because you've got to start understanding what works. And you need to understand humor, and you need to understand drama, and you need to understand engagement. And so you're going to have to do it. I'm sorry to tell you that. And when somebody complains about you having all this fun, tell them it's work. It's part of my job now. Initialization has some randomness. So I pulled some names out of the projects and assigned them and randomly generated the numbers within some parameters. So the size of the projects was somewhere between 5 and 15 million. I'm making those numbers up. I don't remember what it was exactly, but some random number function within there. So there was what you called partial randomization. Pseudo-randomization. Well, it's really randomization within parameters, but yeah. So, and again, remember the asthma? Randomly, it was 50% instead of 15% because I wanted to exaggerate things. So you've got some initialization. And then there's the model. And it presents the initial decision to the user. And they make their choice, and the model calculates the outcomes. What's the new state of the world? Has their rating gone up? Has the rating gone down? Has somebody gotten mad? Have they made more money? Has the stock market tanked? Whatever is in the model. And then you check. Have we reached a terminal condition? Have they won or have they lost? Otherwise, back we go and we present a new decision to the user, and we have this cycle. And it's that initialization of the model and the model itself that we have to capture. How do we do that? Well, here's an unpacking of that. So the user is given a choice. They're in a template that says scenario C, person D, decision X. So this has been pulled from the templates, and they have a choice. And they take a choice, and associated with that choice in the storyboard are a set of rules that say, if they choose A, then blah, 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 blah. If they choose B, then blah, 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 blah. And if they choose C, blah, 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 blah. Like if they choose A, this variable goes up, and this other variable goes down, and we set a flag. If they choose B, this other variable goes down, and this other variable goes up, and we set a different flag. Or we turn off a flag, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then, and we get the values. And that lets us pull out a template which we populate. It states what, depending on which one they choose, it states the next decision. And you pull that out and populate it with elements based upon what the state of the game is, like who you're dealing with, whatever. And you pop that in, and the user makes another decision. Plus, you have your check for end conditions. And yes? I might have one, okay? So I'm going to get concrete about this in just a minute. Okay? So here's an example. This is Edie, who is a patient. And she's got a broken hip. And her pain level starts out randomly somewhere between 1 and 7. Note that we actually show the values here. This was a demo we were trying to sell. So we made the variables values visible so people could see that indeed there was some randomness and some calculation going on underneath. Pedagogically, you might initially show this, or you might not, but eventually you should probably take it away because no patient has a dial on that tells them how much pain they're in. They tell you. And the problem is different cultures have different attitudes towards how much they're going to be, how accurate they're going to be. Some cultures underplay. Some cultures overplay. Oh gosh, you ask how much it hurts so much. And then you make a choice. And we had rules in this like. So the randomness was, do you see at the very top, if random 1 to 2 greater than 1, asthma is true? That was 50%, 1 out of 2 choice. And if it's true, then respiratory problems are already starting at 20%. Now, if you give them ibuprofen, the pain level goes down 1. If morphine, and you go back to this one, if morphine 4 grams, pain level equals -4, respiratory equals +20. Now we would have a trigger, so if respiratory is greater than 40, adverse effect equals true. And that leads you to a different template that's not the pain administration template, it's the dealing with complication template. If time is greater than 5 p.m., go to head nurse. You can run out of time before you've solved the problem, if you're not careful. It's actually pretty hard. And if not, otherwise, repeat this screen. Does that help make it concrete, the types of rules that would go in there? And you're changing the state of the variables, and then you check the variables, and they make some decision about what happens in the world. Okay? Does that help? So, components of rules. There's structure. If, condition, then consequence. You have variables that hold the state of the world. How much pain the patient's in, how much their bank balance is, how stable the network is, whatever it is. Randomness and probabilities. Variability, the way you get replay is to have some range of things that can happen in the range of issues. But you want to make, it's a pedagogical decision about what those are going to be and how much they're going to change. Because too much variability might not let them get the message. And then time is another thing we typically have. We compress time anyway at times, so the boring bits skip by. Or sometimes we expand time because it's too fast to deal with it until we get scaffolded there. And so this was a teaching nurse about analgesic drugs. Select drug interactions. You have the patient profile. Asthma, no. No non-prescription drugs. And then you also have the doctor's prescription, which is interesting because one of the options is morphine 15 grams. The doctor only prescribes morphine 5 or 10 milligrams. You can choose to give 15 if she's in severe pain, and you will reduce her pain significantly. You're going to whack up her anxiety because she's going to feel completely whacked out. And At the end, you're going to get totally chewed out because the head nurse is going to say, what were you doing going more than the doctor's prescription? That's something a nurse should never do. And she will get chewed out, and the message is you could lose your job over that. But we want them to get the ability to make fail safe here rather than in the real world. Okay? Huh? So, I jumped ahead. I was setting this up so that you'd see an example, but I wanted to give it to you. Helpful representations. From a design point of view, whatever representation works is good, as long as it's concrete and specific, so a developer can take it and go, okay, I know what you mean. If you leave ambiguity, they get confused. Flowcharts are useful. This actually is EDs. You give medicine, and then if you get a side effect, you go over and deal with it, and you might get a termination, but otherwise you go back to dealing with the pain after you deal with the side effect. Lookup tables. This was one we did for security, and if you look at the log file, you have a number of choices. Then it indicates where you go next and indicates the changes to the variables. It's the same thing as NIP then, it's just a different format. When I was doing the project management game, I ended up using all three because as I thought about it, whatever worked for me to capture my thinking right at the time was good enough. And I trusted the programmers to be able to figure out what it is. As long as it's specific, not unambiguous, they can deal with it if they're good. By the way, you don't want programmers. You want software engineers. And the distinction is, in this case, somebody who understands not just coding the problem, but separating out and breaking it out in a manageable way. For instance, if you set a variable about how much they react to something, the tuning part is liable to change that. If they are a programmer, they will likely have hard-coded that all through. And when they go to change it, they may miss one, and then you're going to have a real problem tuning the system. What they need to do is pull that out in a constant. Software engineers understand that. It's really important for tuning to separate out the things that you're going to tune from the things that handle the computation. And even then it's still going to screw up, but you're doing your best. Even pseudocode, if disabled equals no, then delay equals +1, else points +5. It doesn't matter as long as it's concrete so that somebody can implement it. But it's important at the design stage to just get it out in a way that you are concrete. Have you ever written anything, thoughts you understood something until you started writing it down and you realized, I didn't quite understand this and you have to revise it. You start trying to create a diagram to represent what you think and you go, oh, I diagram all the time. It's my way to understand the world. That's that point. Getting concrete forces you want to get concrete to make sure your thinking is out there and worry later about in a way that you can communicate it. But make sure you have it represented. And typically, I've found technical people can deal with that if you get it concrete. So you end up needing a storyboard. And for every screen or screen type, so if you have templates that get repopulated, you want the screen type, you need to actually capture what you think it's going to look. Well, let me give you a caveat. I tend to break up design from development. I like that because, as one of my colleagues once said many years ago, a guy named Rob Phillips, who was out at Curtin at the time, I think, he said nobody on his team put hand to keyboard until everything was documented on paper. Now, keyboard, he meant writing code. He didn't mean using Word to document your storyboard. But postpone programming, prefer paper is one of my mantras. So get the design specified, and then you start coding. Because otherwise, if you start coding too soon, it's too hard to throw it away. You've invested. So now, the reason I said that was because if you trust your development team to have good graphic design, and you don't, all you need is a wireframe, and let them figure out a look and feel that constitute it. If you don't trust that development team and you have the graphic design, work out the entire look and feel and communicate that to them, whether you do each screen or whether you give them a look and feel that they can execute against. But you have to make sure. But you want to at least render what elements are there. You want to have any dialogue documented. Ideally, you get somebody who understands writing dialogue, because it's not the same as writing prose. It's very different. And all the responses, all the options they choose have to be there. And if you should do that for mini scenarios, characters, and an overview. Now, again, I have an asterisk. One of the things I have found, and you send this off to get the subject matter expert and the client to sign off on it before you go to development, right? Right? Yeah, okay. If people were looking at me blankly. I want to make sure if there's any arguments about that, let's get it cleared up. There's one interesting phenomena I have learned, that there are about 80 to 90% of people who look at a storyboard won't really get it. So they'll look at it and go, oh, okay. So then you go ahead and build it. And then they go, oh, that's not what I thought it was going to be. And you've got a scope problem because they want to change it. And you don't want to because you've got sign-up. So here's my recommendation. At the same time, find a way to communicate the actual experience. If it's just a small project, you might have a narrative, or you might have screenshots and narrative set up like sort of a comic strip. Sometimes in big projects, you actually build a smoke and mirrors flash version of it, or HTML5 or something, where they can actually play with it. Very limited, not the full engine underneath, but just so they can go through a sample experience. Because you want to make sure they understand it. If you do that and they sign off on it, you have a much better argument that, I'm sorry, if you didn't understand that, you're just, it's a scope change. I don't want to tell you you're stupid, but you're stupid, but I'm not going to say that. You know, that's really what it is. So just a hard-won lesson in the asterisk, okay? Any questions on that? Okay, implementation and evaluation very quickly. You want to get the challenge right. This comes from Csikszentmihalyi's flow. Too difficult and it's frustrating. Too easy and it's boring. And as they get capable, the optimum place is going to shift. And that's part of designing the experience, designing the flow. You don't design content, you design an experience. You want to consider, how do we get their motivation up high really quickly? How do we gradually develop their confidence? How do we keep their anxiety low and their excitement high? You want to explicitly be thinking about their emotional states as they go through this. You don't mind a little anxiety because you want it in challenge, but you don't want it so high that they're just turn away from the game. Same thing with the challenge, same thing with the motivation, confidence, and anxiety. You want to be managing those throughout the experience. You play test. Jeff Johannigman was a wildly successful game designer until he had one experience. He read the review of his latest game. And they said, among other things, great play, this is going to be responsible for more sleepless nights and failed marriages than ever before. And he thought, oh my God, I'm screwing up marriages by making such a good game. And he went off to do a different job. Now he runs training sessions. But he was brought in to work on our game design research project for the e-learning guild, and I co-ran a workshop with him on it. And he told me about this is real game designers playtesting. Playtest with a variety of players. Yourself first, and game-savvy players. And then you want typical target players. So first you get the game-savvy players who can tell you how, from essentially an expert point of view, where it's broken. Then you want to try it with essentially your target audience. And then you want to try it with your cunning, resourceful, and malicious players. They're the ones who are going to find where it breaks. And they're going to find the cheats that you don't want to have people end running with the process you want to get there. And then finally you do it with naive and sophisticated players, unsophisticated players. You want people who are totally clueless to make sure they can get into it and do it as well. This is the process you need to do. And particularly as naive and unsophisticated things, you need what I call the handcuff and gag test. The developers, the designers and the developers, i.e. you, need to watch somebody playing it without helping them. Because as soon as you go, oh, here, just do this, you've missed an entire problem with the design. And I had this rule that they had to watch 3 users with the problem. Because the first time, that's just a dumb user. And the second time, oh, just a coincidence. Takes a third time to see the same problem. They go, oh, I think that really might be a problem. But they can't let them help them watch it. They can't help them past it. You really need to see it. Look for the intuition and common sense work. Do the winning strategies actually match the learning objectives you're trying to achieve? Are there any stupid strategies that work? Because you don't want that. Is the player focusing on the decisions instead, or focusing on some extraneous stuff? Adjust. The game seems fair. Does it seem fair and fun? You know, there's a real problem with a game that doesn't seem fair given the real world situation. And does the player know why they failed or succeeded if they do? These are some of the things. And another version on that. Yeah. I'll get there. Game developers test. They focus test, they play test, they usability test, they naive player test, they unit test, they integration test, they configuration test, they regression test. This is another came from a real game designer. We test content and performance and stability. We test and retest gold master candidates. If we expect the game to affect the player, we test that too. Now this is for commercial, $40, $60 a game type of development. But I want you to see that they tune and test again and again and again. Now to your point, what are engagement metrics? Because you're right, you should set the metrics you're testing for at the very beginning. And the question are, what are those metrics? You need to test for usability and get that out of the way first. Then you need to test for educational effectiveness and get it out of the way. And then you need to test for engagement. What do you test for? Remember, question mark on the screen means you. Okay, yeah. Do they can keep playing? You know, you might have designed it to be short enough. Sorry, go ahead. The frequency, do they come back to it and play it some more? Well, you might have a set time. This should be about a 20-minute game, and is that indeed what it?
The segue of that, how often do they come back and they fail?
Yeah. Okay.
And if they're not actually literally stand behind that vertical shoulder, then tracking the screens where the user drops off or gets stuck, so that you know that you make sure they're not doing
But you know, whether they come back and you know how persistent they are does measure some of their engagement. You know, we're really looking for not the learning outcomes, but are they enjoying this? Now we could measure adrenaline in the blood. Kind of invasive. How about galvanic skin response? Measuring it? What can we do?
Behavior exhibited after playing the game?
It doesn't lead to a change, but that's the educational outcome. That's not the engagement.
Looking at their faces all the time.
Look at their face. These are very objective measures. But really, engagement is subjective. You can't say it's a game. Only your players will tell you it's a game. It's subjective. Do they enjoy it? That's all that really matters. Was this hard fun? Oh, yeah, I liked it. Good. Is it, you know, you can get absolute. Would you pay $40 for this? Or would you pay $5, whatever it costs? Relative. It's better than anything I've had before. It's better than a kick in the teeth. Or its average rating is better than X% higher than previous even. But really, it's just their opinion. That's what matters. Are they enjoying it or not? So you can just ask them, but I suggest you set some expectation. Have them rate it. If they're rating it 3.5 or higher out of 5, I think we've succeeded. Otherwise, we keep tuning. Why do you need metrics? When do you stop iterating? What?
When do you stop iterating?
Yeah. When are you done?
Convergence.
When are you done tuning?
When people are having fun?
Yeah. Well, that's the right answer. Too often, the real answer is when we run out of time and money. Time and our money, right? Oh, okay, we've got to stop. In fact, Clark Aldrich, who did the virtual leader game that was all about using influence to accomplish goals in an organization, he finally had to stop and add a score because his investors said, you got to get this on the market, start getting returns. He didn't get to tune it as much as he wanted. Now, I want you to have set engagement metrics, and if you start running out of time or money before you start hitting your engagement metrics, I want you to go back and evaluate them. Maybe you need to lower, it's the Holy Manager scope, resources, schedule, but I want you to do it consciously. And maybe that we have to abandon this. It's not going to be fun enough, and all the money isn't worth it. But I want you to do that consciously, not subconsciously, just by accident. Tools. Going from branching to model-driven and the complexity of the environment, what tools should you use? Power, you can go up, you get more power with Captivate or HTML with Torah. You mentioned doesn't exist anymore. It was acquired by SimWriter, Smart Builder. And then you get up to this line where you start getting the model-driven. What everybody wants is a really powerful model-driven tool that's not complex to use. It doesn't exist. To really model the world, I argue that the different things you're modeling, it turns out the nuances actually require vastly different models. And there is no simple solution that will capture it any better than a general purpose programming language. So Flash used to be my answer. 3D engines, game mods, Java, C++, or consoles, if you're developing for there. But really, there is no silver bullet, to use Doug's phrase from yesterday. You really just, when you get into model-driven, you've got to build a model, and you've got to use real model-building tools. I would love it, I'd look for it, but I think, in principle, it can't exist. You're going to have to go through the whole modeling exercise, be very specific, it's going to be like programming. But I want to suggest learning can be hard fun. We can do this reliably, repeatably. So, think decisions. Please, use that on your subject matter experts, focus in the game. And, use yourself to focus your objectives. At least do many scenarios. Please write better multiple choice questions. Push for branching and consider model-driven. The business case is roughly, if it's complex learning, if they need a lot of practice because it's really important they get it right, that's when you start arguing for model-driven, where they need a lot of practice and a lot of replay. The environment is inherently complex, or it's really costly if they screw up. Why do you think the military uses simulators? Why do you think airplane pilots love simulators? Because it's costly if they screw up. Medicine is a big user of simulators. You match need to death. Small changes meaning limited practice branching. If it's serious shift, you need a model and budget. Communicate. Please communicate. Now, when we wrote the Serious Games report for the E-Learning Guild in 2007, we ended up calling it immersive learning simulations because we found out that the companies who were going to buy the report, 80% of them blocked the word game through the firewall. I don't like blocking things through the firewall. I think that's just sort of cutting off part of your people's brain. But we call it immersive. Call it what you have to, but the argument is it's just better practice. Next to mentored life performance is the best practice you can do. So, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that made sense. I hope that gives you something actionable to take home and start working on tomorrow or Thursday or Monday next week, whatever. Don't let it atrophy. Really put it into practice. Start looking at other people's designs and say, why aren't they, other people's e-learning, other people's designs, say, why isn't this as much fun? What could they be doing that you could have captured here? So that's it. You're free to go. Happily answer questions as a group. We have theoretically 5 more minutes, and then we're done. Anybody have any questions on that? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. You're free to go.